Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today and welcome to our webinar, Your Complete Guide to Behavioral Interviews. My name is Katie Reynolds, I'm in the marketing department here at LaSalle Network. And before we dive in, I wanted to give you a little bit of an intro into what we do at LaSalle. So LaSalle Network is a staffing and recruiting firm, and we specialize in accounting and finance, customer service, call center, healthcare revenue cycle, supply chain, technology, HR, executive search, and more. Oh, one moment. It seems like we're having some technical difficulties. One moment, everyone. Yep. Sorry, everyone. Apologize for the technical difficulties. Give me one moment. Okay, I think we've got everything sorted out. Sorry about that. All right, as I was saying, on LaSalle Network, we currently work with more than 3,000 clients, and to date, we've placed more than 35,000 candidates. Now today, I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Tom Gimbel. Since founding LaSalle Network more than 17 years ago, Tom has become a nationally recognized expert on job search strategies and interviewing techniques. He's worked with thousands of clients who use behavioral interviewing, so he knows what they're looking for when they're asking these questions, and he knows how to help you prepare. We can talk today about how that's different than traditional interviewing and what kind of answers you should be prepared to have. Now, in order to get the most out of this webinar, we encourage you to participate. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, don't hesitate to put them through the GoToWebinar box, or you can tweet them at LaSalle Network or at Tom Gimbel. If you do tweet questions at us, we encourage you to use our hashtag behavioral interview. Now today, we're going to go over briefly what behavioral interviewing is and how it's different than traditional interviewing, what you can expect in a behavioral interview, how to answer behavioral interview questions. Tom's going to talk about the STAR statement, and then we're going to talk about how to successfully follow up after a behavioral interview. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Katie. I love a good webinar on a Thursday afternoon. Glad to be with everybody. And we're coming from Chicago where the skies are sunny, and we are excited to talk about something that's really important in the job search, and that is the interview process and the different types of styles that different companies have. And behavioral interviewing is definitely one of those styles. There's argument whether it's productive or whether it's effective, but at the end of the day, companies and employers and hiring managers are using it, and we need to be ready for it. So what is behavioral interviewing? It's a technique used by employers to learn about your past behavior in particular situations. Excuse me. Tell me about a time when is usually how that starts. So the question is why? Why has this become something that employers want to use, and why has it become more prevalent now than ever before? And what people believe, a large percentage of the professional world believe, is that past performance is a good predictor of future behavior. And so if you're going to be managing large groups of people and somebody wants to know, tell me about a time where one faction of your team disagreed with another. Or tell me about a time when in the human resources role you had conflict with finance. Or tell me about a time that you were reporting to two different people simultaneously and you had to prioritize which way you were going about doing things. Right? It's an important aspect to give people some sort of inkling of how you're going to communicate in the future. How effective is it? It's always up for debate, but you know we have found a resource that we like a lot in Catherine Hansen, and she is with Quintessential Career Presses, who's published a lot of her work. And her question or her research showed her that behavioral interviewing is approximately 55% predictive of future behavior on the job. What that means is that almost half the time it isn't, but half the time it is. And that's what you have to realize is you can't fail at knowing you and how you did certain situations, because that's real life. And you may do it differently another time, but how you handled it and what the results were is crucial. And traditional interviewing is said to be only 10% predictive. And the reason that's true is because that means people are hiring on personality versus execution. Now, 80% of job seekers say they've been asked a behavioral question in an interview. The question is how you answer it. And there doesn't always have to be that there was success from what you did in your past experience, but that you learned from the decisions you made in a certain situation. Right? Let me repeat that. It's not always that your answer to the behavioral question is that an overwhelming success in what you did. It's that even if it failed, you learned what you did wrong and what the situation was and how you would do it again differently. It's so crucial, so crucial. But what can you expect, right? So, hopefully you're better than these guys going in for interviewing from Step Brothers. I think we need to look at this, and you need to be thinking, what could they possibly ask me from a situational or behavioral interviewing standpoint? And this is where you really have to look at, right? Tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time if. And when that happens, or a time how. And I think when you look at that, it really is knowing you. And you've got to look at your projects. And a lot of the things that you've accomplished throughout your career are applicable answers to a myriad of different questions. And so you've got to look back through your career and projects that you did. Look at your resume. Look at your LinkedIn profile. The information is usually right there for you, right? But if you're in a call center, tell me about a time when you had a disgruntled customer call in and how you handled that. If you're in sales, tell me about a time you weren't hitting your numbers and how you altered your action plans midway through the quarter, so on and so forth. And that's where the traditional interviewing is, how would you handle dealing with an upset coworker? Right? It's hypothetical. You don't know what the situation is, right? Versus when you move into a standpoint of behavioral interviewing, tell me about a time when you had to deal with an upset coworker. Your answer begins with what the situation was that made the coworker unhappy. In the hypothetical, you don't have a real life situation. In the behavioral, your answer starts with, terrific. I'm human. Obviously, I've had disagreements with somebody who was upset. And let me tell you about a time I was working with Mark or Mary or Steve or Bobby and how we handled that. He or she was upset because of X, Y, and Z. It's a chance for you to show your humility, and maybe they were upset with you or something you did or a project you were involved in. So you can actually show that you're humble and you make mistakes or you cause friction, and at the same time give them an example of where something went wrong. So what we're going to do next, I think Katie's going to jump back in, and we're going to have a poll question regarding behavior, obviously regarding behavioral interviewing. So Katie, I'll let you take it from here.
Absolutely, Tom. Now everyone should see a poll question up here. Have you ever been asked a behavioral interview question? And if everyone can vote, either yes or no, pretty simple. By now we've got a pretty good introduction into what a behavioral interview question is, so you should have a good idea.
Well, I'm hoping they're not wearing tuxedos to prepare for this, Katie.
All right, and it looks like we've got everyone answering. Now we'll show everyone these results. Now here you go, Tom. These are some pretty clear results. Got 99% say yes, that they have been asked a behavioral interview question, and only 1% says no, they have not been asked a behavioral question. So that's a pretty clear answer into how many people think they've seen this before. Now the question is, are they fully prepared for it?
Yeah, I think I'm having a little bit of technical issues on my computer, so let me see what we got. Perfect. So be ready to talk about your experiences. And I think it's one of those things of knowing the details of a project and where you were um, successful and where you failed. And I think whether you got to look at what your background is. It's different on every situation. But whether you've been a manager, a supervisor, or you've been a staff person, you've had real life experiences where you've interacted with different people and where there's been problems. And you're looking for a job, and I always call a job interview, and it depends where you are in your career. But if you're a $50,000 a year person and you're 40 years old, that means you have 25 years left, right? And 25 times 50 is $1.25 million, right? That means your interview is a $1.25 million deal you're going on. And if you don't take the time to look at your career before you go in, look at the managers you've worked for, look at the projects you were involved with, the successes, the failures, the terminations, the promotions, and know that, then you've failed at knowing you. And you're going to fail at behavioral interviewing because there's an expression that people use. And that is, it's a heck of a lot easier to remember the truth than it is a lie. And if you start lying on a behavioral interview type question, you're asking for trouble, because it will catch up to you either A, during the interview process, or B, worse, after you've taken the job that they've offered you and then you fail, because that leads to termination. And believe me, it is better to not get a job you think you want than to get fired from a job you did want. Know your strengths and know your weakness, right? And you've got to realize, right, it's always easy to point at humor as a way to explain something, but to say something that's irrelevant as a strength is silly, right? To make a strength a weakness in order to make yourself look good, it doesn't fool anyone. But when you say that your weakness is that you work too hard or you're a perfectionist, then you've got to give examples of how that's failed you. Otherwise, it sounds like a bunch of BS. In the interview, be specific. Describe what you actually did. Keep the focus on you, not on the group. I was part of a group, and I don't want to come across as egotistical or narcissistic. However, I want to explain to you what my role was in that group. I think that's an important aspect of showing you that I have perspective on what I'm looking to do, right? And we talk about, again, the movie references are easy, but The Devil Wears Prada. And to understand that you are there to execute and get things done for someone. At the end of the day, we all answer to somebody. And if you can't be specific on the issues of what you did or didn't do and where you succeeded and where you failed, you're missing the boat. In the interview, you can't lie. You can't go into an interview and say things that aren't true. Let me rephrase that, because I just lied to you. You can go into an interview and you can lie. People do it all the time. But when you go in and lie during an interview, it will catch up to you. It'll catch up to you on a reference. It'll catch up to you when you interview with another person in the company and they compare notes. And or, like I mentioned earlier, it will come back to haunt you when you can't execute on a part of the job. And eventually, unless you're in the business of trying to get big severance packages because they want to get rid of you, you're going to get fired, and it's not going to work out. And you've just got to be open and honest with yourself and realize, and this is where behavioral interviewing can really benefit you, is to realize where you failed about something that you would normally maybe give a white lie or fib about, and explain what you've learned and how you would handle it differently in the next situation. And that's where you get to the STAR technique. And I'm not one that invented it, right? I'm one that's here to talk about it and to give you some opportunities to expand on things when they're asked. Situation, task, action, results, right? Situation, task, action, results, right? There's no point in being overly repetitive with it. You just have to realize the beauty in it is the simplicity. The situation, who was involved, what took place, where were you, when did it happen, right? Was it 15 years ago? Was it yesterday? Why did it happen? How did it happen? Remember, a lot of behavioral interviewing and situations may have resulted by your own, you may have created a problem, but then how you fixed it. You haven't seen The Martian. It's an excellent film. But there's a big problem there, and you have to look at the situation and analyze it and figure out how to get out of it, right? And if you can't acknowledge those questions, kind of like being a reporter back in the day, who, what, when, why, where, how. The task. What are you tasked with? Based on the situation, what was your task? What was involved? Had you done this before? And I got to tell you, having been through a situation 75 times or one time, there's strengths and weaknesses and positives and negatives to both. But be open and honest about it. Because maybe on the 75th time you did something different than on the 50th time and your results were different and you learned from it. And then the first time it may have gone well, but you learned that maybe you should have done something sooner or in a different way. You know what the task is, but now you've got the action. What was your step-by-step thought process? And then thought first, execute second. How fast was the turnaround? From when you thought of it to when you executed it, when was the result? And if it's a project, you've got to explain how you interacted with the different people on the team. We've all been in college, and let me take that back. We've all been in high school. Good chunk of us have been in college, and we all had group projects. And sometimes we were stealing from the Peanuts analogy, right? Sometimes we had Lucy on our team, and she was pulling that football out from us. When we went to kick, we fell on our back. But other times we had people that were always there for you. There was always Linus and his blanket there to help. And you've got to acknowledge that too, and how that made you feel, and how that allowed you to execute your action to complete the task based on the situation. Because then you get to the fun part, the results. What was the outcome? What did you learn from it? How did your actions move the needle for the company? Quantify your results. Did you save the company money? Did you reduce expenses? Did you increase sales? Right? Oh, we did this elaborate marketing project. Let me explain it to you in detail what we did. But guess what the results were? We never tracked the revenue. Got to tell you, you missed one huge aspect of the star, right? The results are crucial. Okay. I think Katie's going to take it from here on an Ask the Expert. Katie, you going to jump on here?
Yeah, so Tom, we've walked through the STAR technique, and kind of that's a good framework for many of our listeners, but let's bring it down to real examples. So Tom, I'm going to ask you this question, and you answer using the STAR technique as if you were an actual candidate, and this might be helpful. So Tom, tell me about a time you demonstrated great leadership skills.
Well, I fail all the time, so that's... I would tell you that. So thank you I'm glad you asked that question. And the best chance for me to really relay to you where my leadership skills came into a positive light was, and I'm going to look at this from the STAR technique, right? So I'm gonna tell the story of when I failed. And so I made a decision with a client engagement that we were going to tackle something that we probably shouldn't have, because the resources and the margins weren't there for the resources. So the situation was, I'd made a decision to work with a client, and X, who the client was, right? It happened to be 6 years ago. It was located in Chicago. It happened because we were a growing company, and a client came to us and wanted to work with us based on our brand, but they weren't ready to pay us. And it happened because of a referral from the good work we'd done from other companies, for other companies. The task was, can we execute at a high level? and deliver the results based on the margins that were imposed on us. And it was difficult because we weren't making enough money to do it the right way. Had we done it before? Yes, we'd done it before, but never with reduced expenses. The action. What was my step-by-step thought process? Are we going to look bad in the market and look bad to the client simultaneously? And are my employees going to feel like failures because they don't have the ability based on numbers of people to execute at the level they've been trained and developed to do? How did I execute? I looked at the situation and I said, do we need to exit ourselves from this? How fast was the turnaround? I did it very quickly. So we won the RFP to do it. We went in and met with the client, and over a period of about 2 weeks of going through negotiations on the final contract, I sat down with my team and I said, these guys are trying to cheap out on everything, and we're going to fail. And we're better off to remove ourselves from the process now that we've seen the writing on the wall than to get into this and then pull out 6 months from now. What was the result? The result was about 40% of the leadership team of this company that was involved in the process said, we agree with you. There isn't enough money. You're being nickeled and dimed on this thing. It's not right. What did I learn? I learned that being open and honest with a client is always best, which I knew before, but we had never gotten a project on an RFP, on a request for proposal, that was this size. It was exciting to win. Winning in business is a drug. It's addictive. You want to do it. How did your actions move the needle for the company? Short term, step back. We didn't get the revenue. Long term, my staff looked at me and said, we're going to stand up for the right way to do things. And I built more employee loyalty than most any other decision that I ever had. And the results were my company went on to unprecedented growth over the past 6 years.
That's a great example, Tom, and it's definitely a good, positive example to use in an interview. Let's tackle another question our candidates might struggle with that talks about more of a challenge. Tom, describe a time when you struggled to build a relationship with someone important, and how did you eventually overcome that?
I think I worked with, I have a company of close to 200 people now. And the important thing for me is whether somebody's 22 years old and out of college or 52 years old and coming in as a seasoned professional, that I have to have relationships that are really successful with everybody I encounter with. And that's important for my role because bad relationships spread like weeds in a yard, in a garden. And so if you have one with one person, no matter where they are in the situation, they're going to, Tom's a jerk or Tom's a great guy. And you got to figure out how that works. And you can have uncomfortable conversations with people and have them still say you're a good person, right? But when you freeze somebody out. So I struggled to build a relationship with a staff person who was doing some things directly for me. And it didn't go so well in the beginning, and rather than realize that they were new to the organization and learning how I worked, which I knew all those things, but I was focused too much on where the failures were, and rather than the long-term situation on everything. And I wanted to make sure that we just were moving fast, and based on moving too fast, I didn't build that relationship. So how did I eventually overcome that? I number one, embraced criticism. So I had this person's manager talk to me, and I'm one to exaggerate a little bit, and the manager basically beat me over the head with a club and said, either fire somebody or work to have the relationship. They need to believe in you. And this is, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years. And so I was open to criticism. And then I sat down and I walked over to the person and I said, listen, let's go out and get a drink or dinner and let's talk. Let me get to know you a little bit and figure out what's going on. And we never even talked about the problem. The person just needed to know that I was willing to invest the time in them. And the result of that was the person's been here now for, as I said, 5 or 6 years. They've contributed on a multitude of levels and projects. and I consider him a close friend. And so it's really worked well. But I had to be humble, take criticism, look at the situation, and then focus on my actions to get the desired result, which was a great employee and great execution.
That's a great example, Tom. For another more challenging behavioral interview question, could you give me an example of a goal you didn't achieve and how you handled it hypothetically with your boss?
And so I think for me, I'll just give you something, a real life experience. So I'm in an interview and I'm the CEO of a company, and I very easily could be in a situation, and it would be different, but every CEO doesn't land in a CEO job. And so you never know where you're gonna be. And I got to go back in time, 15 or 20 years ago to talk about a goal that we didn't hit. And I vividly remember I was working for somebody else. We had aggressive sales goals. I was running a small sales department in my early 20s. I didn't know much other than work hard, sell, execute in the business that we sold. I didn't understand the psychology of people or managing people. And I had a goal to hit revenues, and I needed more than just me to do it. I couldn't do it alone. And at the end of the day, we hired a guy who wasn't a good salesperson, and we shouldn't have done it. I kept him too long, and I grinded him. And what I should have done was admitted that he wasn't the right person, and I could have focused all that energy on me selling, and maybe I would have had a better shot of the company hitting the goal. And I went to the owner of the company, and I said, listen, I know you were involved. I know we're a small company, but I own this mistake. And I feel as though if I would have come to you sooner and said this person isn't the right fit, and I would have taken the onus on myself to sell more, that we would have had a much better shot of doing it. And I just want to be upfront and honest about it. And to me, it's about realizing where I miss, where that fork in the road was. And I think that's really what we're talking about when we're looking at situations. Is we're saying, where was the fork in the road? Where I went left and I should have gone right. And if I would have gone left, what would I have done? And by going right, how long did it take for me to realize that I went the wrong way? And the results aren't always good, and it's not always fun. But that's just the reality of the situation that you're looking at in behavioral interview. So, we're coming up on 12:30 here, and I hope that there's been some good learns and some good takeaways. You can follow up with us. You can follow me at Twitter at Tom Gimbel, and our company is at LaSalle Network, and we have a Facebook page, LaSalle Network on Facebook, and we're always here to take any questions and help in any way we can. And so if you, oh, you know what, I missed that part. I jumped ahead. Katie, you got to interrupt me on that stuff. So the question, this slide was meant to be, how do you follow up after an interview, which is basic, whether it's behavioral or traditional, is you always want to follow up. If you would have asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said, get a handwritten note or a typed letter to somebody thanking them for their time. In today's day and age with hoteling and remote offices and people traveling all the time, email's best. What I would tell you is, as often as possible, do it from a desktop or a laptop computer, not your phone, for 2 reasons. Number one, it sends a message that you didn't just do it on the fly when you had nothing else to do, but you took time and focused on it. Number two, spell check is better on computers than it is on phones. And number three, you're not as rushed, and you'll review it a couple times in order to get it right. So, not the worst to send it from your phone. However, remember this, if you send it from your phone and it's 3 days later, someone may be thinking, well, if you're just going to send it from your phone, why don't you just do it right away? Right? There's a multitude of perspectives. So if, Katie, I think you're going to take it over from here, and if there's any questions that anybody has.
Absolutely, Tom. We've got quite a few questions here. One of our listeners is concerned. She's been out of the workforce for about 10 years, and so it's been a while since she's had that professional experience. How should she approach that when she's asked a behavioral interview question?
Well, I think the number one thing to do is this. My guess is if you've been out of the workforce for 10 years, that you are probably a parent. And if that's the case, embrace it. Don't avoid it. and just say, you know what, I've been out of work for 10 years raising my kids. Don't try to make raising your kids into a corporate job. It doesn't work because the challenges are very different. And what you want to say is, I'm going to have to go back into the time machine here and tell you about something from 12 years ago and an example that I had. Your examples are still real, and the difference is at the fork in the road, you've now got a decade worth of perspective. And you can look at somebody and say, I've thought about my career before I had kids all the time. Because when you're raising a family, you got a lot of time to think, right? You're crazy and you're running around 100 miles an hour, dropping carpool and doing these things and feeding kids and doing it. But you also have a lot of time where you're sitting there and you're thinking about, what would I do if I weren't with my family, if I weren't with my kids in your career? Relay that information. I've got 3 kids. I think about my kids when I'm at work. I think about work when I'm with my kids. We all do those things. It doesn't take away from the experiences you've had. You got to share those correctly.
Tom, how should our candidates and listeners handle a behavioral interview question if they have trouble remembering specific situations? Are there any memory tricks they can use or any tips you have for them if they have kind of a shoddy memory?
Well, I think that goes back to the actual experiences and how invested you were in the situation. And so, you know, when it comes down to it, is whether your memory is good or bad, is there's experiences that were impactful to you. And if they're relevant to the job, there is no makeup on that. You might not remember everything all the time. None of us are robots or perfect. However, this goes back to not failing you. And if you don't have an experience that triggers in your brain that's similar to a question that somebody asked you, then you may not be right for the job. You may not, if that's important to them, you may not be remembering it because you may not have had that experience that's similar. And if you have had one that's similar and you can't recall it, then there's another reason that you may not be right for the job. And sometimes it's just admitting it. You know what? If I can't remember how I did something similar 3 years ago, then maybe I won't have the ability to take on this challenge. And that's okay. That's okay. To admit you're not, it's very similar to dating. To love somebody who doesn't love you back, you don't want to be with that person. But yet our heart and our mind tells us we should be with that person. And we cry and we're sad and we don't eat and we don't sleep and we don't do these things. But at the end of the day, if that person doesn't love us, we shouldn't be with them. And it's the same thing for a job. If the job isn't right for us, no matter how much we think we're right for it, we're not. You got to move on.
Tom, if you can't come up with a good example for answering a behavioral interview question, is it worth using an example that went wrong and talking about what you would do differently now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If I didn't elaborate on that enough, I apologize. But if there is a situation that somebody asks you of, tell me a time where you successfully did this, say, you know what, there is a situation that I unsuccessfully did that, and what I can tell you is what I learned from that where I wouldn't make the same choices again. And I think that can add a lot of value.
Another question we have is, can you use the same story or the same example to address multiple behavioral interview questions?
Well, if you're sitting across from Mary or Bob and he or she asks you 3 different questions and you use the exact same story with the exact same experiences 3 times, I would say that's probably a negative. You can use it. I don't know if you're going to get the job, though.
And then another of our listeners is curious, how would you approach a behavioral interview as part of a group any differently if you're in a group interview?
You know, I get asked that question a lot, so it's a really good question. And the answer is I wouldn't answer it any differently. What you have to do is you have to look at who the people are that you're interviewing with and know their backgrounds as best you can. So usually with our clients, when they're doing group interviews or internally when we do group interviews, we have everybody on the interviewer side introduce themselves and their roles, right? So you don't want to make sure if you're sitting across from 3 people out of finance and 2 from human resources that your story doesn't bash those departments. You've got to have some sort of self-perspective and political correctness to know what groups people are in and not talk too negatively about departments like that, okay? So I think that's really important. But otherwise, it's more about body language and eye contact and looking at people and relaying the story. And know that if you're talking and you to know which department people are, use the oldest trick in the book. Align their business cards on your side of the table in accordance to where they're sitting on the opposite side of the table. And that way, when you're telling a story and it's how you interacted with somebody in the marketing department, you quickly make eye contact with the person from the marketing department, right? So these are things that you need to do in a group interview, that you need to acknowledge that you're talking about something that directly affects one of the people on the panel or in the group interview, that you make eye contact and you acknowledge that.
All right, well, we've got a couple more questions here. Tom, do you have any tips for how you would combat nervousness pre-interview?
You know what, and that would be, I don't want to play amateur doctor. I think you've got to look at, however you've gotten over nerves in the past, whether it be for a high school basketball game or debate club or going on a first date or when you ask your wife to marry you, whatever it is that you've done in the past, I would do it the same way. What I usually find is preparation calms you down when you get in the moment. And oh, can you be over prepared? I don't really get how that happens, right? You want to be able, as long as you are prepared and you know everything, then the question is, are you too robotic to go off of that? And that has nothing to do with being over prepared. That has to do with who you are and how you answer questions. And you've got to be comfortable enough to be a casual communicator and at the same time illustrate what you know to be true.
That actually segues perfectly into our last question. Another of our listeners is curious, how do you respond to behavioral interview questions without sounding too rehearsed? Like you've walked through the STAR technique right before the interview.
Well, I think it's like any other story you're telling. There's gifted storytellers, and there's people that aren't. And if you feel that you are not a great storyteller, apologize. You know what? I'm not the best storyteller, so hopefully this will come across in the right format. But here's a time that I did this and did that. When you're speaking the truth about real-life experiences, it usually doesn't come across as robotic. When you're talking about things that have never happened and you're talking about things that are formulaic, then that comes across as scripted. So I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about knowing the experiences that you've actually done and what the results were. And when you do that, and if it's factual, and the other thing is that for everybody on this webinar, speak about something you're passionate about. When you have passion for something you did, that comes through. Passion sells. Passion sells. What I got?
Well, I think that's a great place to end the webinar. Thank you everyone so much for joining. I will be sending out the recording afterwards so you can all listen to this again and hear Tom's tips as well. And I'll be sending out a PDF of the slides. Thanks everyone for joining. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you.